What we're talking about is teaching testers to non-testers, and a little bit about the, it's a little meta, because talking about a talk. So this is kind of talking about a workshop that I've done several times, many times, within my organization. And that slide that I showed you is actually the same way I open up that session. As far as people sit down, they show that, and we start pretty cold by going into an activity right away. And I'll get back into digging into a little bit why and wherefore. Again, this is for teaching testers to non-testers, so I would expect that you guys probably had a lot of tests for that question. To give you a little bit more context, especially about me, I'm Keith Falanga, Director of Quality Assurance at Huge, and that's my Twitters. I want to talk a little bit about Huge, because that'll actually help, again, with context to give a little bit of idea about who we are and what we do and how that's potentially different. Just so, again, you have a good idea about when I'm talking about things as to why I made the choices that I made and what made sense for us. So you might be able to guess based on this that we're a marketing company. We work with a lot of brands. So we have a lot, we're not really product-based, we're project-based. So we do a lot of things for lots of different people, and that's on a day-to-day level. That means anywhere between 12, 14, even more projects in flight at any one time, with many different technical stacks. Some could be apps, that could be in-store experiences, that could be websites, and the QA folks at Huge kind of touch all of them. So I'm going to go into a little bit about the workshop. I'm going to talk about how I kind of got the word out about the workshop. We're going to talk about that stapler again. We're going to talk about testing. Talk a little about oracles and heuristics, which is also included in the workshop that I give. Some other kind of good stuff. And talk about what the kind of testing skill is. So let's start with the workshop. I was trying to actually rack my brains, because I've been doing this for a long time, about what was the actual moment that made me decide to do this. And I actually could not remember it. There are lots of things where I'm sitting in meetings and I'm like, why does this person not understand something? That's something that I need to take a next step about. Or having a conversation or things like that. I'm always looking for, hey, what can I do about this thing if this thing isn't as optimal as I want it to be? So I'm going to assume that this workshop was based out of some sort of weird comment that I got in some meeting or something along that lines, pretty much acknowledging the need for this actual workshop. And some of those goals that I had for this workshop, as well as the other QA folks that were involved in helping to create this workshop. And again, I'm using QA, which I know is potentially a bad word in this group, but that's actually the name of our group within our company, so I'm going to keep using it. So I understand that testing in QA, that capture terminology, could potentially problematic, but I'm going to keep going with that terminology, because that's actually, we're talking about the context of my work. And in that context, that's the title that we use. So we probably want to get a better understanding of what the testing is as a skill, a deeper respect for the testing role, and really kind of going with some of the theme of this conference. If you are in a cross-functional team working in some sort of agile-ish way, more than yourself might be involved in the testing process. So how do you do that and handle that in a safe way? And this is one way of accomplishing that, or at least the start of that way, to kind of begin to teach people about testing in a way they haven't necessarily thought about it before. So it's kind of open for all. It was advertised publicly within the company. It's every month or so. I haven't done it as much lately because I've just been busy, as you do. But every month or so is pretty much the cadence. Small groups, 10 or under is kind of preferred, since this is a workshop. That happened. And it's sometimes specifically requested, depending on project needs or people. As the word has gotten around, it's gotten a bit more popular. So the tools I say that we need to be brought to the table, if it's a laptop, especially if it's going to be a distributed team, if you have teams in different offices or countries, you may not be able to do this in person. So doing this via Hangouts or Skype or whatever works for whatever kind of video conferencing solution that you have. I've done that as well, mostly through Hangouts, different degrees of success there. But the most important thing I wanted for my kind of company is this habit of like bringing our laptops to meetings and doing a lot of multitasking. I'm the worst at it, just like anyone else, but I didn't really want people to do that at our at this particular workshop, and I wanted to set that expectation early. That if you're going to come to this workshop, you're giving me an hour and a half of your life, and I need all of it. So it's really, if you don't have time to do that, then you should go to the next workshop and not this one. It's kind of part of that. So kind of the things to think about if this works for you is like when and how would something like this be useful to you in your company? It may or may not, and kind of think about that as you kind of move forward. So I'm going to give you some examples of how I got the word out within my company. Again, your company or organization or whatever is going to be different, and you have to kind of know how information kind of flows through your company to figure out the best way forward. This is just what worked for me in my company based on just my experience there. I've been there for about 5.5 years at this point. You'll notice that this is from February 2015. One of the more, which is the oldest email I could find about this in my email. And this is for the entire tech team in the Brooklyn office. We have many different offices. And the tech team consists of developers, architects, QA, and tech directors, which is a little bit more almost salesy type of folks. So everyone in that group was the first people that I targeted for this. And you'll note that it's pretty much anyone with a QA title should not come to this, which was initially very confusing for the QA people who initially signed up for this workshop when I specifically told them it wasn't for them. But then they got sad about it, so then I told them what the workshop was, and like, oh, it's not for you, but it's going to help you. And that made things better. And some things are redacted, mostly because my phone number is there. Don't call me. I don't even have a phone at my desk. I don't really know why I have a phone number in my signature. We have an internal kind of social media tool at my company. It's called Honey, where it's almost Facebook-y type of thing, where you can post a lot of things to different kinds of groups. So this was actually off-topic global. So every single office everywhere, pretty much everyone in my company has access to this particular post. But it's also internal to the organization only, similar to the first email, and also just a link for a call to action as far as to how to sign up using this Doodle kind of software, which just makes it kind of easy to kind of find good times for things. And I'll give you an example of one of the responses for this. And I'm not sure how much you can kind of see here. I guess you can. That's helpful. This is a bit hard. Number one, you can see that nobody wants to do it on the 31st. Everyone hates that date. But you can kind of see I overridden the names with their kind of titles and kind of what they do. So you have an idea about, like, no one was specifically invited to this, but lots of different people signed up. Lots of people were actually interested. So I think it's important to note that don't assume people are not interested in what you do. I kind of hear that a lot, that people don't understand us, they don't get us, and like no one wants to. But you know what? A lot of people are very interested and want to know more, especially some folks where our roles might overlap, in addition to a little bit more of an agile environment. Again, if you're working in a cross-functional team, this is even more important. But you'll see that it runs like a lot of PMs, a lot of developers, client services, which are pretty much project manager type people. Our SEO guys, because we actually have those. Again, we're a marketing company, so we have people who are specifically focused to help our clients with SEO needs. Some content strategy, which is interesting for us, again, and some directory type folks as well. So you can kind of see it kind of runs the gamut as far as who would be interested. And again, even like our resourcing director, the people who kind of helps us put people on projects, it's important to know how we work and what's involved with it. So that's kind of how we got the word out and kind of moving forward. This is actually helpful software to make that happen. So using Doodles is helpful, but there's a couple of other different programs that do something similar. Let's talk about that stapler. Again, as I mentioned, that first slide is the same first slide I used in the actual workshop. And I do that on purpose. Number one, it is something that everyone can relate to, but it does not actually affect their day-to-day lives. It's not software. It is not the things we do every day, but it's something that everyone can kind of understand. Although I was making some comments that the actual people who have used a stapler are kind of diminishing. How many people have actually used a stapler day to day? I may need to think about a new thing. But what I discuss as after that, as far as we do that, we go around the room and they talk about what they've actually created. Some struggle, some don't. I've actually been very impressed by developers who are really good at testing, and a lot of other folks really struggle. I've been impressed by project managers the same way. So I've got to like run the gamut of kind of getting a good feel for the room at this point too, about how they're engaging and things like that too. So again, kind of running a workshop, you're always trying to kind of engage the different skill sets in the room. Sometimes I've done it for just all developers, which kind of changes your audience and changes how you discuss things. But sometimes it's been a really mixed group. And how a project manager looks at a project, how a developer looks at a project, and how a designer looks at a project are all kind of 3 different points of view. And you're trying to speak to all of them. So this is kind of a good way to kind of get a feel for them as well. So pretty much we want to say like everyone can test at a certain element. Pretty much everyone has been able to do something with this particular activity. You didn't need to know the details of stapler manufacture. This kind of speaks to a little bit of should testers code or not. You have to know everything about how software works in order to test it. In some cases, no, you can still add value without that and kind of just touching it for those who may not feel that way. And everyone has some different points of view on what to test. Part of what I've done a couple of times, is people to kind of share their tests. So they write down some tests, I'll give it to someone else, and then they kind of talk about it. So they can see that everyone else thought something was a little bit different in importance. So different points of view in testing, the same type of object, the same instructions, are you going to get very different results from. And I actually do have a physical stapler. I didn't bring it here because of airlines, and I don't know where staplers fit into the TSA rules. But I actually have a red swing line stapler, which is important, it's red, in a packaging, and I bring it to every single workshop. There's very few people who actually want to pick it up and touch it. Everyone just looks at the picture and kind of thinks it through. And then I talk about what does that mean, kind of also speaking to touching on exploration, how important it could potentially be. And how do they actually know what to test? Because they've used a stapler in their lives, they have an idea about what should work and what shouldn't. And again, I touched a little bit about why a stapler. Another reason why I use a stapler is because of Mike Kelly did this, and I can speak to his experience because he blogged about it, and that was convenient for me. So this is, again, one of the slides from the actual workshop. One thing I found is that he actually apparently changed his blog at one point in time, and it was down, and I couldn't find the blog post. So I actually do recommend taking a screenshot, even if it's really big, just so you have it for history. So if you are going to use external sources like this, take them, because if you don't own them, they could go away. And that was actually a big piece of this kind of workshop that was actually pretty successful. One reason why I was successful is because he has like, what did I say? 144 different tests. Yes, he had a little bit more time, but that kind of speaks to the skill of a tester and kind of how they think through things. And again, touching about, again, using other people's kind of experiences, bringing them in and being like, here's what this person did. And again, kind of going to that depth of skill of a tester. Some thought is like, what else could you use besides a stapler? Again, kind of making sure that it's not something that's in their day-to-day lives, that they can actually be forced to look at testing in a different kind of direction. Maybe it's a vending machine, but that's a little hard to bring into a conference room. A pencil, a cup, it could be anything that's very kind of simpler that everyone has used in the day-to-day life that you can talk about testing with. It's a tool to kind of get to that end. So what is and isn't testing? So again, knowing this group of folks, they have strong opinions on this. So I'm talking about the content that kind of works for me. I've actually quoting some folks that are at this conference, hopefully correctly, although they might have opinions about it. So I've listed some of the sources, but arguments can be made for accuracy, and that's fine within this context. The reason I chose those things on purpose, because I wanted to bring out specific points that would be helpful for me to get what I needed across in this workshop. Another thing to kind of keep in mind is I really want to talk about the concepts over the terminology. And I'm going to talk about a lot of terminology, but that's not really what I'm driving. Terminology is helpful to make sure people are aware that there is terminology within our discipline, within our profession, the fact that we have a discipline and profession, that it's not some sort of side thing people don't need to think about. We really want to teach us the concepts. If they don't use the difference between testing and checking correctly, I'm not going to correct them afterwards. It's more important they understand the concept, at least to me. I don't have to know everything about testing to actually do this. We have a lot of really awesome people. They've blogged a lot of really awesome things. There's a lot of material out there that you can kind of use for 2 reasons. One, you don't have to make this all up from scratch. That's helpful. But it also brings a little bit of legitimacy to what you're saying. That we do have thought leaders in our field, that we do have experts in our field, and you're actually, the fact that you are actually paying attention to your community, you're paying attention to your discipline and your profession, and you're continuously learning, kind of gives you some brownie points, and your QA or test team brownie points. So it's kind of helpful to kind of show, again, that we care about what we do. We're constantly learning about what we do, and we're kind of seeking information from outside sources and not just internal ones. But if you do have internal sources too, then use those. But I find it using external sources helpful to what I was trying to accomplish. The first concept, I actually really like kind of talking about the difference between testing and checking, especially with this cross group of folks. I like people to understand that concept. Again, concentrating on the concept rather than terminology itself. So these are some actual slides. We probably know these in this group, but if you don't, here's what a testing is, here's what checking is, and there's a difference between the two. How I kind of verbally describe it for may or may not be accurate is that testing is a little bit, what happens when I do this? Checking is it this, yes or no? It's a little bit more binary associated with it. Of course, we know there's more to it than that, but that's a very simplistic way of explaining it to people who may not otherwise understand it. I just like the slide of like the little machine, little hand, like you want to balance both. I kind of speak to the fact that there's not a value judgment between testing and checking. Both are really valuable, both are very useful, and we always use both. But knowing that difference makes you better at both. So checking is very helpful for both the human side of things as well as the machine side of things. Testing is very important on the human side of things and how we use tools. And thinking that through is very helpful. So the kinds of things I talk about here is, again, one reason why I use that stapler exercise because I can keep referring back to it, which I found very helpful for the workshop. So going back to that, which of those were tests versus checks? Which of those did you not know the answer to? So what happens when I try to staple like a whole, like how many different sheets of paper versus I'm going to try doing 13 slices of paper because the specs said it was 14, so I'm going to do 13 instead. The difference between a check and a test, and talking through their actual answers and kind of talking through what that actually means to make it more real and kind of something to kind of, so it's not some kind of concept that's hard to kind of understand, why the differences matter, is one better than the other. Most important things is going to be very like, how can this practically apply to them on a project level? It's nice to talk about concepts, but how do you apply those concepts to them is really important. So I'll usually speak to that if they're on a project that I know about or something like that. I'll use examples from their day-to-day lives so they, again, can kind of have that kind of understanding. How does it apply to the automation strategy, which is really my underlying reason to kind of really kind of push this? So people have a better understanding about that automation I feel is actually very useful. Checking is very useful. All that is very useful. It's a very nice hammer, but not everything is a nail. You want to actually think through what's valuable to do and use each particular one as it needs to be. And understanding the difference between testing and checking will help you make that choice a little bit better. Exploratory testing. In the past, we were a waterfall company to start. We transitioned to be pretty agile now. But in the beginning, as we kind of made that, I had a lot of like ad hoc and the thought that if you were doing testing without test cases, it was ad hoc. It was a unskilled activity, and you were just banging in a keyboard. And that's a concept I wanted to kind of dispel as not true, because we do pretty much 100% exploratory testing. We don't do test cases, and I wanted to have a better understanding about what exploratory is and the fact that it was a viable option. So it's not really ad hoc, and again, you can kind of talk about a little bit of the terminology, but I thought in this particular instance it was important to talk about it's not just banging on a keyboard, it's more than that, and talk a little bit more about that. The fact that it's not a new concept. 1984 was a while ago. And really highlighting this last sentence from Kim Kaner's blog, that all testers are exploratory testing. Some do it more deliberately in intentionally skilled ways, and saying that here at Huge, we do it in a deliberately skilled way. And this is how we kind of do things here at Huge. Again, the definition, which many of you probably have seen, that exploratory testing is something in learning, test design, and execution. This is kind of important because a lot of exploratory testing is done in a tester's head, and I needed to make sure people were a little bit more aware about what's going on in a tester's head when they're going through this. Because if you don't really understand it, it does look like just you're banging on a keyboard and you're not really thinking through what you're doing. So I need people to have a little bit better of understanding with that. Since we don't have a lot of documentation, then I need to kind of replace it with something else. Here's what I replaced it with, and here's what that means exactly. So some concepts I've discussed. How is this a viable option for testing? How does this concept practically apply to them on a project level? Again, kind of speaking through that. We have, I mean, this is especially helpful for new project managers who may be coming from other companies where they do have QA that are kind of going through test cases and a little bit more waterfall, or if developers have never worked with QA before, because that's happened as well, or testers, or whatever term you want to use. It's kind of helpful to have a little bit more of an understanding through that. And how does this concept tie into the first of kind of what exploratory testing is, and how does that mean as far as testing versus checking? I know that there's a, James Bach and Michael Bolton have written a Exploratory Testing 3.0. I think that was a year or so ago. I kind of still reference the 2.0 because I find that easier for non-testers to understand. Although we can kind of concept that all testing is exploratory, I understand that, I believe that. It's really hard to describe that to others. So I use material from 2.0 because I find that a little bit easier to explain to others. If I'm just talking to another tester, then of course my strategy is going to change. But I'm talking to non-testers and I want to actually adjust my terms to the actual audience at play. So oracles I've actually had a personal struggle with. I didn't always have this included. One reason is because I have a personal struggle with this as a concept. So it's hard to teach something you don't have a good understanding of. I decided to include it after I went to a session with James Bach, kind of went over it. So I felt I had a little bit more of an understanding of it. But this speaks to a little bit more about making what we do in our heads more explicit to those who are not reading our minds. We talk about a lot of this in the testing community, but those outside of it have no idea. Whether you call it an oracle or exploratory testing or heuristics, which I'll go into in a minute, it doesn't necessarily matter. I think that's the concept that really matters, is to make sure people understand what's in our head, since if you're going to be going pure exploratory or doing a lot of the testing, if you're kind of moving away from that check boxes kind of test case kind of world, and that is more of waterfall, which I think most companies will or have at this point. So I think we as testers really do need to understand this for ourselves, as well as teach it to others to make sure that there's comfort within the company to do that. And part of that is to kind of speak to the skill involved with that and what those are, and oracles are one of those. So this is one of the things on the slide. A way to recognize a problem that appears during testing. Again, going back to that stapler example that I do up front, to figure out how did you know how to test that. There's also kind of something that was like, okay, what are the, like a Photoshop type app, and like what are the oracles would you use for that? Hey, a paintbrush is something that you understand, so you kind of have a good idea of what a paintbrush should do, even if you don't read the directions. Again, how do you test without being specifically told what to test is a very important concept for me to get across to people. That's something that we are able to do. We don't need reams and reams of requirements in order to test effectively, although it's helpful. But that's not all we're going to do. So we kind of make an activity, which I just kind of talked about, of trying, you know, find something and then kind of talk about what the oracle is of what you're actually going to test. I didn't have a really good response to that. I think part of that is just me, because I've always kind of struggled with that concept as a concept, have a good understanding of it. So it's hard for me to describe it to others. But if you do have a good understanding with that, it might be useful to use in your, if you're going to actually do this workshop. So how does this help you think about testing, and how does this concept practically apply to them on a project level? That's going to be on every single one. Heuristics. So I have what my definition is, and again, what Michael Bolton's are, and since people don't know who Michael Bolton is, I have to make a joke. So my apologies to Michael. But again, going back to the rule of thumb, short-term general technique is for thinking and planning. What I do highlight in Michael's is that it's a fallible guide. So it's not always helpful, but it's helpful in some circumstances. And then I go to some kinds of examples. Some of these you probably know. Here are some from James. And I kind of go through exactly kind of what that actually means and kind of what that would mean on a project way. Here's hiccups, which again, a lot of people kind of know. Here's mine. I kind of did this. I had to do a presentation to one of our clients who was doing some dog fooding internally. And they wanted me to do this talk for them and their company. It was required for everyone in their company to go, because again, they're kind of dog fooding the specific tool and their changes that they're making. So they needed everyone involved in the company to come to this because they're going to be beta testing or dog fooding these changes, and they wanted feedback, and they wanted to make sure that they had an idea about which kind of feedback would be helpful. So this is a little bit, it's pretty dumbed down, but it's pretty dumbed down to not even people who are even in the software development world, people that are outside of it, but still having an expectation of having to do some testing or testing type of activities. So, you know, don't just test in Chrome, test in other stuff. Don't forget to move the phone around. Responsive is actually really important. Text fields, buttons, incognito mode, and then the heuristics cheat sheet I found to be very, very useful, and so I kind of spread that around. Again, building on what currently exists rather than creating too much of my own. But I find this level is very helpful for those who have like just not touching this world at all. Project managers, developers have an idea about what we do, but there's some people who have no idea what we do. So it's for those people that these kinds of heuristics kind of put together for. So here's a kind of a example activity that we've done that I found to be very helpful. It was actually put together from Adam Rosenberg, which is a kind of another person that we work with at Huge, one of my very senior folks. So we talk about the variables, mostly kind of focusing on Elizabeth Hendrickson's book, Exploratory, and kind of going through that. So kind of the setup for this is that, hey, here's these buckets of heuristics. Can you think about a test you can do either on your current projects or a software or an app that you actually feel strongly about, and can you create a test for one or two of these particular buckets? So for things, can you count? What kind of test would you actually think about that would actually fill that kind of variable? And I find this to be very helpful. And this also kind of teaches back that I'm asking for tests and not checks, which helps kind of drive home a little bit more of that concept on a practical level. So I give them like 5 minutes, they kind of sit and write some stuff down, and then we kind of talk about it in a group. And there'll be people who give me checks and not tests, and I can nicely kind of talk through why that's a check and not a test. That kind of be able to kind of drive home the checking versus testing kind of concept. But also, again, being nice about it, because we value both. Saying, hey, that's really great, it's a good thing to do, but can you think of a test for that? Find the bug. I'm not showing you this because we use it for interviews. So what this was, or is actually, is an image of a web page with which a bug in it that illustrates some very important concepts to us, which I'm not going to really go into, again, because it spoils it. But this is something that you can do as well. If you find a defect or a bug that you find to be a really good tool that you think someone outside of testing would really get, always record those. Pay attention to those. File them away for use later, and this is one of the good uses for them. Again, this was like a real bug and a real project, and so people can kind of talk through that. And as part of that, I don't just talk about finding the defect, I kind of talk about why that defect exists at all, to kind of go into that zooming in and zooming in kind of out kind of concept that we do a lot in testing. It's like, yes, you've asked me to test this one part, but that kind of part kind of touched this other part, and so I'm going to test that too. Making sure people can kind of think through things in a more exploratory way, and not just being, hey, I'll just write up this bug for the developers to figure out. That's one reason why we do it as an interview question, because that's a little bit what I'm looking for. Here's some good stuff that didn't necessarily fit into some other things. Again, kind of going back to that, I've used this workshop in a multiple of different kinds of ways. Communication is important. And kind of talking through, hey, if you find something, don't just kind of write up in a bug. Did you kind of just like walk over and talk to the developer or hit them up on chat or something like that? Or if you have a question, or if you want to go to the design reviews and talking to the designer, that especially in a cross-functional team, communication is really important. So though I'm going to speak to you in a second about how to write a bug, talking is actually the most important part of any project. And don't be afraid to do it. Everyone should do it. So if you have questions about what QA is, talk to your friendly neighborhood QA person or tester or whatever works for you. So again, this is what fits for us and kind of how to kind of write up a bug. Again, if you're in a context where you have non-QA, non-tester people testing, what is the output of that test? How do they actually communicate effectively what they've found? and so can be actually easily acted upon. I've been in situations where that has happened, and the bugs they've written has been terrible and very difficult to act on, and so then we have to kind of have continuing conversations. Conversations are good sometimes, and sometimes they're a bit of a waste of time if you just kind of gave it the detail in the first place. So this is why this is helpful to have PMs, designers, developers pretty much know how to write a bug usually because they know what they want to see, but pretty much non-QA, non-tester, non-developer folks kind of need this in order to know how best to give feedback. So we use Jira, so I'm kind of using that particular concept so you can make it use for whatever bug tracking tool you got. But yeah, have a good summary. So if you're listing out all the defects, you don't have to technically have to dig into every single thing. So have a really detailed summary, and then you can dig into that if you need more information from that. So if you have a list of bugs, making sure you have an idea about what's wrong based on the list. So a good summary is important. The environment, that's often missed so many times when a non-QA, non-tester, non-developer is actually writing up a bug. Where did you find this, especially in the web world? Was this Chrome? Was this Firefox? Was this Explorer? What are you actually using? What version? What OS? All that is going to be very important to figure out if you can actually reproduce that problem. And as people just don't include that. Expected actual result. I like the expected result first. I've had arguments. It doesn't necessarily matter. Steps to reproduce. Visual example. Again, this is very web-based, and I know not everyone is in the web world. But a full-page screen grab, hopefully with some arrows pointed to things, is very helpful. I've seen a lot of people who just do a screen grab or an image of just the actual problem. And again, going back to the zooming in and zooming out, it's really hard to put that problem in context. So sometimes it's very helpful to have the full browser, especially if you have the full kind of URL in there as well. Like, oh, wait a minute, you tested in staging and order testing in QA right now, so you shouldn't even know that's the wrong environment, so that's why that problem exists. So making sure you're kind of giving more information than you kind of think that you do. That's why I think a full page screen grab is helpful. And again, here's a little bit more of what that would look like in Jira, kind of going through that. The importance of the testing skill. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't. It depends on the group. Testing skill is a foundation. It's a foundation of a house. Get it? Okay. And that foundation is very important for how you build on that foundation. And so there's lots of concepts like performance testing, security, accessibility, unit testing, even just basic communication and automation. You need that strong foundation of testing skills in order to do these other things. And that's something I kind of really want to kind of drive home, that this testing skill touches on so many different other aspects of a software development team, not just the tester, not just the QA person, not just the person who's primarily responsible for it. It touches so many different other elements. So having a good depth of skill in testing is going to help you regardless if you're active in that testing or not. Slightly early, but I'm done with the meat of this. If we want to kind of go into open season, this is part of a template that we have for all of our slides. That's why it says questions in the open season.
Thank you very much.
That's it.
Thanks to that. Somebody has a question. Can he raise his green card? I got it too over here. Some more? 16? And a 3. Thank you. Start with a 2. Mike.
Can you tell some stories or anecdotes about what has come from the courses you've given? Has it changed the world in your company?
It's changed the world.
Are the PMs amazing now because they know testing? Like, what's the success for you?
Variable, just like everything in life. Some good successes where I've got the feedback where project managers will plan projects a lot more because they understand how long things take. And they have already actively, people who have gone through this have changed how they allocate resources to projects based on this because they understand there's a lot more involved in what we do, more so than they did previously. So they've changed a little bit of that from a project management standpoint. Developers have worked with QA folks a little bit better after this because they understand a little bit more, again, what's kind of involved with that. So pretty much stronger teams, I'll put it that way. So it's been beneficial. Anything I can particularly measure or point to, mostly anecdotal, but enough anecdotal evidence to show that it's been very helpful. Also, people keep asking me to do it. One example, which I kind of forgot to mention, was that was a project that didn't have, there was like 8 developers and only 1 QA resource available. So that changes that dynamic a little bit. Usually if I'm in an agile project, I kind of recommend 2-to-1 ratio, and that's not that. It's 6-to-1. That changes what that QA person's role is on that project to more of a, okay, testing has to get done, and how does that happen, as opposed to only individual doing it, especially in a more agile way. So I gave this to the team prior to that project starting off to aid that QA person a little bit, to give them a little bit more ammunition to help with that. But also, since the developers are going to be taking on some of that testing responsibility, so they can do that a little bit more effectively. And that really helped that particular project.
Thank you. Number 16 was, sorry.
Hi, going back to the beginning of your presentation, you showed us the different roles that often signed up for the workshop. I'm really curious if there's any particular roles that kind of boycott it, don't feel they need that information, and if so, have you done any reflection on that?
If they have, they haven't said. I mean, there's always going to be individuals. Like, this is a lot, kind of a huge, used to be an ironic name, but it's no longer. It's 1,600 people, which is a lot of people. So I don't know everyone. And this is mostly focused in the Brooklyn office. I have given it to some other offices as well, but mostly focused on one particular office. So it kind of runs the gamut as far as some feel they need it and some that they don't, but have also really been asked for it. But Huge is pretty good as a community where they do want to learn, so that they do want this kind of information that QA is already kind of respected. And we already kind of look to kind of not be told, but to tell. And this is one way to do that.
Okay. We got number 3, which was 3 today. Great.
Very similar question. It has been hard to get the people that you wanted to attend these sessions, and if so, how did you handle that to get them there?
Oh, there's 1 or 2 people who are on my list. So they're not against the idea, it's just time. And it's how far do I push? Because they've asked for it, they want to do it, they say, yes, this is important, I need to understand things better because problems happen. And so one way to solve that problem is to go through this process. But they haven't really made the time. So it kind of comes to me as far as, how far do you push? And that balancing act I'm not 100% certain of all the time. It's also a little bit of a problem with my availability. So I think the one thing I've learned from this, I need to have other people kind of be able to kind of make this presentation as well, so it's not quite so limited to my availability, to have so many other QA folks do this. Kind of going back to Anne-Marie's time talk about like more people kind of taking on this kind of leadership type of situation and make it not just for me to do. There is a little bit of weight added to like, hey, you have a director title, and you know what you're talking about. May or may not be true. But have it come from a QA analyst or a tester or whatever it is, and be able to do this presentation to their own team, I think would also be extremely valuable. So that's actually something that I would probably do different moving forward and might still do. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. I saw Mike, you're on the stack, and Harriet is also on the stack. We also have a Twitter question coming in.
Twitter questions.
Yeah.
Which one are we doing first?
We're going to do this, the Twitter question first.
Question first.
Yeah. A Sully tester is having the following question. How do you have the sort of influence on non-testers you described when the organization is hostile to exploratory testing? And one of the area of concern is that new testers might be already poisoned by bad testing ideas.
Oh, I don't hire them. So that's the short answer. So, I mean, that kind of, I have the ability to make that choice, being the person who kind of talks about what the standards are in our company and does a lot of the hiring. So we don't necessarily have that problem, so it's difficult. There are going to be people going to be hostile coming in. So then your audience changes, and maybe you need to kind of do this workshop or something similar to it to those testers who may not have a good understanding of what the value of exploratory testing is, and talk through it. I do another talk called Testing is Your Brand, Sell It. It's on YouTube from last cast. Who might kind of go through some of that helpful kind of tips about how to handle that kind of environment and make it a little bit better, hopefully.
Okay. And we go to Mike, number 2.
So I don't know how you do onboarding at Huge, but have you considered making it a semi-compulsory part of your onboarding process?
We're not good at onboarding. I'm not gonna lie. A lot of it does come from our hiring process is pretty difficult, and we have a very high bar. So I would only bring someone in who already has a kind of strong understanding and strong ability in exploratory testing. So that helps with the onboarding. But we do kind of have more of a mentorship kind of situation to make sure new people have a mentor that have already been suitably brainwashed appropriately to kind of spread that brainwashing around.
Onboarding for non-QA.
Onboarding for non-QA, my apologies. That's also not good, so I don't really know. I do a lot of proactive. I work with finding those holes and trying to fill them. So they may not be part of the onboarding actual process, but if I see someone who might need it, even if it's another discipline, I will offer it or talk to their actual supervisor, manager, or whatever you want to call it.
Okay, thank you. We're going to Jim.
All right. So how many senior level management folks have attended? And if they have, what has their feedback been like? What has their reaction been?
Well, one thing that happened, we had a restructuring a year or two ago. We've restructured since, but at the time, I didn't have direct reports anymore, and all the QA folks were going to be reporting into directors of engineering. This is actually one of the first times I did this particular workshop, was for the directors of engineering. If you're going to be in charge of these folks, you have to have a better understanding about what they do. Luckily, they were very into it and very supportive, and I think that really did kind of help moving forward. But again, it is a little bit more proactivity on my part to kind of find that out. But again, I am lucky to be in an environment where most people in that position are happy about that kind of education and either seek it out. Most of the pushback is based on time and availability.
Thank you. We'll have another question coming from number 3.
Yes, I was wondering, because you have this workshop where you need to attend, do you also have some kind of lighter version where it's a paper version, a PDF version?
I don't give this out because I want the voiceover. I find that to be very important. You notice in my slide there's a lot of just images only with voiceover. Every time I do this workshop, it's going to be a little bit different. My voiceover is going to be different. How I feel that day is going to be different. The audience is going to be different. So every time I do it is going to be different. And having images as opposed to a lot of text, there's a lot more text in this one than the actual workshop. Makes it a lot more flexible. So I don't really have that because I don't want them to be doing this, looking through things in a vacuum. If they want, I can give them some links to the stuff that already exists. There's a lot of links here. So I'll give out the actual links if they want to learn more, but I don't actually, I want to make sure that that information is filtered and there's actually available for questions. If they're kind of learning this in a vacuum, they could potentially go in a direction that doesn't make sense for us.
Okay. Are there some other questions? Last call for the last questions. Otherwise, we have to thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.